Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Flight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have such a great show for you tonight. We are here with Major Cameron Hillier of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, otherwise known as NORAD. This is turning into an annual visit from them with such cool things, not just the background of NORAD, but the inner workings and what has been happening lately in the news, in developments, and in what matters to our nation's security in that regard. And so really looking forward to a great show. Before we get started with that, of course, a quick introduction I'd like to just thank everyone for all of your support of Social Flight throughout the past year, and it's been challenging. We started this, of course, Social Flight Live back at the beginning of the pandemic. We are now approaching our 100th show in that time. And it's been great just to see all of General Aviation come together. We do everything that we can through SocialFlight.com and the free SocialFlight mobile apps for Apple and Android devices to give you things to do, places to fly, $100 hamburgers, but to keep General Aviation strong, especially during this challenging time. We also have the Fly to Win Challenge, where if you fly to a local airport, you can get points, you can win prizes, and of course, so many online events like tonight's show. And we have something very special I want to show you for here at tonight's show. We wanted to come up with something unique that was just able to help people. They've asked us how they can help support the show, but I think it's really important to give back as part of that. So I want to show you a little surprise here. That surprise is, let's see, is this little guy right here, which is so amazing. And if you've been following us on YouTube, you know that we've got a P-51, a T-51, Titan T-51 Mustang that we're building. And this is a custom made, we had this engraved in the glamorous Glenn III P-51. It is a 3D, fully engraved in glass, lit from the bottom on this beautiful wood stand. And this is something available. We only have 20 of these right now, very limited right now. And if you are interested in supporting Social Flight and having one of these absolutely gorgeous things for your home, I'll show a picture of it as well. Let me bring this up just so you can see a little bit better picture. There's an image here, and this shows you another image of it as well. If you would like one of these for your home, all you need to do is email at info@socialflight.com or respond to the registration for the show. These are available at $100 and plus a shipping charge to get it to you. It's minor, and it supports the show. We only have 20 of them right now. And if you're in any way interested in having this really cool piece of artwork for your home and helping to support Social Flight, we definitely appreciate that. So again, that's info@socialflight.com. And now let's get directly to our show, of course, with Major Cameron Hillier. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is a joint military organization between the United States and Canada. It's charged with the mission of aerospace and maritime warning and control for North America. The dedicated men and women of NORAD, they are basically our nation's first line of defense, and it's an incredibly important thing. Originally from Grand Bank, a small fishing village in southern Newfoundland, Canada, Major Cameron left his hometown for the first time at the age of 17 to go to university in St. John's, and he joined the military after graduation. He's been deployed to numerous regions, including Kandahar, Afghanistan, serving with the 10th Mountain Division, as well as supporting Operation Nanook, Canada's annual Arctic sovereignty exercise, and a variety of other operations around the world. Major Cameron Hillier has been with NORAD since 2018, supporting several NORAD military responses, including aircraft entering Canadian and American air defense identification zones, domestic airspace violations, aircraft hijackings, and of course, tracking Santa every December 25th. Welcome to the show. Let me bring him on now. Major Cameron Hillier, how are you this evening?
Oh, pretty good. Yourself?
Excellent. Thank you so much for making another appearance and starting this tradition here for Social Flight Live.
Oh, glad to be a part of it.
Now, I want to recognize uh, for you, you have a different rank than you had last year. I want to
Mm.
congratulate you on that.
Yeah, basically, me and my former supervisor had a fight to the death, and I won out.
I guess it worked out for you, and I'm guessing for the nation here. I want to show people as well the logo. A lot of people don't actually know the patch that you're wearing on your shoulder, and what it means. And I think it's fairly symbolic of what it actually does in terms of NORAD's function.
Yeah, no, so yeah, referring to the airspace, warning and airspace control missions. One thing that's not probably accurately captured in the emblem is that we picked up in 2006 our maritime warning mission as well.
Mm. So tell me a little bit about help people understand compared to many of the different divisions and branches of military that people are more traditionally familiar with, specifically how NORAD is organized and what encompasses your mission, because it is very, very unique in the way it's staffed and also in the fact that it is this bilateral organization.
So the origins of NORAD began in 1958 when Canada and the United States were facing a Soviet threat at that point, and kind of trying to figure out a way with the likely of approach being from the Arctic, how do we kind of deal with that challenge? So Canada and the United States basically entered into the binational command, which is NORAD, basically mutual benefit between assets and then geography, as far as giving like a early warning of what potential Soviet threats and the threat of nuclear war for the late 50s on through. So it has now, since the mission has evolved since then, obviously, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, had a transition into violent extremist organizations following 2001, obviously. But as we get towards more modern day issues, we're more focused on, say, peer competitors at this point, and dealing with the threat of current and evolving threats around the world.
Let me show people. We've got a couple images from inside, which I don't think most people get to see, and I think it's pretty important. And I love the phrase that's here, because that's exactly what you guys do. You have the watch. So take me on a quick tour of what this is.
Yeah, so that's essentially the center of our command operations center, but the NORAD and NORTHCOM Command and Control Center, the N2C2 as we call it, currently being rebranded as the Joint Operations Center. Totally separate conversation. But the long story short, that what you're seeing down the middle is uh, basically the stations for FAA on the left. There's currently a Canadian uniform sitting there right now, and the space operations folks monitoring things to the right. Outside the frame to the left, you have the air domain, and for the left of them, land domain, maritime domain. Basically, what you said earlier, kind of a joint awareness piece with regards to being a partner command with the U.S. Northern Command. But NORAD ourselves, we're focused on the air domain, but as current and evolving threats have kind of dictated what we're looking at, we're taking a very much of an all-domain approach.
And if we look at something from, this is going way back, what it used to look like, is that accurate?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how accurate as far as what the current operations tempo at that time was, but certainly for a post picture, give you a decent look inside Ent Air Force Base and the operations center at that point. So I think that picture was taken in 1957-ish, I think.
And there's one other that is here that's also kind of interesting. What is?
Yeah, so that is essentially a depiction of our current efforts, basically being the global information dominance experiments. Without getting too deep into it right now, but essentially it's about amalgamating centers from all domains into a common operating picture, as it were, available not only to NORAD Command, but also, say, U.S. Northern Command and other combatant commands, so that we can all kind of look at the same picture and be able to draw the, make assessments as a collaborative, global
Mhm.
team, as it were, and then come up with solutions how to address those threats.
And where we always think about the mountain, of course, but that's kind of old school at this point. Where is NORAD located?
So NORAD headquarters has always actually been at Anti-Air Force Base, or Peterson Space Force Base, as it's called right now. The operations center has changed. Initially, it was at Cheyenne Mountain, but since then, as the organization grew, the mountain did not accommodate our growth. So we had to kind of peel out of there and then go to our basement at Peterson Space Force Base, but we still maintain Cheyenne Mountain as an alternate command center.
Got it. So NORAD, if I understand it correctly, serves as this kind of a wraparound of North America for all the sensors, everything that kind of could be intruding from all angles, and you're the, I guess, filtering all of that with every other controlling agency for civilian flight or things like that, or maritime, to determine and understand and identify what is a threat. Is that accurate?
Yeah, pretty much. So I mean, the difference, so when we talk about the assets and the sensors and how they're all contributing, uh, I think we're just one of many users in a lot of respects, and we try to make a very collaborative approach. Like say, we use radars from FAA, Transport Canada, Spacecom, other combatant commands, NCIS, among others. Basically, so they're contributing to their missions, their own missions, basically for that awareness piece. NORAD basically, leverages its own assets as well as those ones I just mentioned, basically satisfy its mission requirements. And its mission requirements is essentially to give adequate warning to Canadian and American leadership about potential threats to North America, and then from there to determine what an effective response would be.
So in doing so, we've talked in the past when you've come on also about actual response coordination as well. So tell me a little bit about the assets that NORAD works with when, for example, you've got to scramble something that's intruding in airspace.
Yeah, so as a binational command, NORAD has committed assets from both Canada and United States, whether it's CF-18s with the Royal Canadian Air Force, F-15-16s with the Air National Guard, or F-22s out of Alaska. So with those committed assets that we can dial up or dial down based on what we can see the threat environment being, we can get more assets if required, but steady state is basically we have a certain number of assets which are dedicated to the NORAD mission, and then from a command and control aspect, NORAD as a binational command can pull on assets from one location to another to address a threat. Say, for example, whether we need extra tankers or AWACS in Alaska to address a growing threat there, then when we can pull those from continental US and or Canada, whether it be additional fighters or tankers, to pour in there to satisfy that requirement.
Got it. So it's kind of like a sort of an agreement on loan, sort of to kind of create some of those forces or allocations.
More like certain assets are dedicated, like say, for example, I mean, obviously maintenance is a very significant part of air defense operations, as you can imagine. So let's say, for example, if say 2 fighters out of Alaska were no longer able to continue their NORAD mission, let's say, right?
Mhm.
Then those 2 fighters is not subtracted from the NORAD assets. It's up to the force provider at that point to replace those 2,
Got
right?
it.
So
Right.
the commitment remains whether the assets or not. So it's just a matter of maintaining that commitment, and of course, depending on the threat environment, we can basically dial up that requirement to meet the
Mhm.
mission requirements.
That makes sense. So can you talk me through an example of like a typical thing that you face with either someone actually testing borders, for example, of course, around near Alaska with Russia or something like that? What happens on a more routine basis, and what might happen a little more of an exception?
Yeah, I guess very, very, very routine. Far more routine than most people think. I'd say to the tune of somewhere around 1,500 times a year-ish. Uh, we have folks who violate temporary flight restrictions in domestic airspace.
Okay.
Uh, so something like that, for example, would be in DC, where there's a special flight rules area set up, and basically that's an airspace security bubble
Hmm.
over DC, Capitol Hill, whatnot, of course, to protect national leadership there. Uh, and then some folks who are flying VFR, not listening to radio or didn't read the NOTAMs, and simply not aware of that security bubble being in place. So they enter the radius area, which is typically about 30 nautical miles, stemming from the center, and don't get in contact with FAA, who's telling them to leave vector out. And then next thing they know, they have an F-16 on their wing, tell them that they need to get out.
So that and that's orchestrated through NORAD when you have TFR violations.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the common answer to all of these questions is going to be a very partnered approach to everything we do.
Hmm.
So to kind of walk through the administration here a little bit. So the Secret Service establishes the requirement to have that security bubble in place. FAA administers it.
Hmm.
NORAD enforces it.
Oh,
So
got it.
yeah.
So when a response has to be ordered because of that, when the FAA sees something and that happens, and there has to be a response, that actually goes through NORAD. Then when we hear about, like you said, uh, fighters off of the wing
Mm.
of a Cessna somewhere, that's basically gone through you guys.
Yeah, exactly. But again, very graduated approach. Communication is the first line of defense for most things. So ideally, FAA would establish radio contact and then vector them out, and that way we save the gas.
Yeah. And you said there's about 1,500 of those per year?
Yeah, roundabouts. Yeah, so between the airspace violations and the response to them, yeah, somewhere between let's say 1,500 violations and 500 intercepts, somewhere in that ballpark range. Yeah, but far more common than we would like to think.
Wow. And is there an equivalent to that in Canada as well? Does other TFRs for all the government officials or top level government officials in Canada as well?
So we do establish temporary flight restriction in Canada as well, to the same tune as the SIFRA, the Special Flight Rules Area in DC.
Hmm.
But they typically tend to be more related around, say, G7 gatherings and whatnot, much less prevalent than they are in the continental US.
Not as common and not necessarily following every place that the top level folks go.
Exactly.
Exactly. That is very interesting. Now, tell me a little bit about on the border side of things, and I think what probably involves a little more concern than the average GA pilot that didn't read a NOTAM. Um, what tends to happen on those borders and with other countries?
Yeah, so to kind of give you a ballpark, as far as like, so we have set up kind of a border around Canada, the United States, air defense identification zones, where the Canadian, American, ADIS, KDIS is kind of how we break them out.
Hmm.
Uh, and we typically have about 6 to 7 incursions per year. Varies, of course. So since long-range aviation patrols have been recurring since 2007. That 6 to 7 number has been persistent throughout. However, the range has been as low as 0 in a year and as high as 15.
The range of about how many incursions, basically. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about ADIS incursions. So walk us through a little bit about what we're actually talking about, because we've seen as pilots, most people on the show here at Social Flight are pilots. We know that there's this ADIS, along the whole perimeter of the coast that's on the sectionals that we can see on the charts. What are kind of like those limits, those trigger points for you of outside ADIS, inside ADIS? What does it all mean for you?
Well, I guess the first thing to mention is that ADA is, of course, international airspace. However, it functions for us as kind of a buffer to kind of trigger a military response for any foreign military aircraft that are approaching our airspace. So it can range anywhere between, say, 50 to 200 nautical miles out. Of course, and that varies based on proximity to other national borders, for example. But for us, essentially, it's kind of just taking a look at it and say, okay, if they cross this line, then we need to basically identify what that is and then determine what potential threat the assets are and then what sort of security measures we need to have in place. There are some times when foreign military aircraft enter the air defense identification zone and the appropriate thing to do is simply nothing because they're just skirting along the outside, continuing along somewhere else. Other times they're nuclear capable bombers coming within 30 nautical miles of the airspace, so therefore need to let them know that we're here and we can keep them out. Uh, so a very important strategic message in and of itself, but so that extends in as far as 12 nautical miles. 12 nautical miles beyond the coastline is sovereign airspace. So we need to stop them well before that, otherwise it becomes a much different scenario.
Yeah, and I would imagine that amount of that's a short distance to be that can be covered very, very quickly. So, uh,
Yep. Fortunately,
so
F-22s and F-18s are much faster than that.
wow. So you said, anywhere from 0 to maybe 11 or so times per year, there is an actual ADIS incursion that generates some type of response. Is that accurate?
Yep. So the number of times we've responded by conducting an intercept has averaged between 6 and 7 per year. Uh, like I said, as low as 0 in a year, as high as 15.
How was 2021 been?
2021 has been, pretty good, fairly peaceful so far. There have been a few responses, if you will, for air defense identification zone incursions, but 2020 was a little bit different. We had 14, so basically one shy of that modern day high.
Yeah, I remember the last time we spoke, it sounded like with the debut of COVID and the impact on governments and people and militaries and everything around there, there seemed to be some probing going on of military readiness. Do you think that was what was causing 2020, and maybe now that things have, it's kind of still here that there isn't as much probing?
Well, I mean, I'd love to be able to tell you that I'm well read into the minds of strategic competitors and what they do, why and when. But from our standpoint, all we can just basically say is we're constantly ready. We have the watch, and we will meet them each and every time they choose to approach our sovereign airspace.
Got it. Absolutely. Now, what has been, there have been a lot of exercises, I think, also going on that are coming. They were happening back in 2020, but you've got some that are actually coming up in 2022. And it seems like the joint exercises are a really kind of interesting sandbox for both our joint militaries as well as, for example, Russia watching and doing their own kind of practice when we have things going on. Can you tell us a little bit about what's coming up with Arctic Edge and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, much like everyone knows, there's a lot of focus on the Arctic lately for a variety of reasons. Basically, interest there and interest for our standpoint also bleeds into security concerns. So in that respects, we've been continuing to develop, improve and maintain Arctic presence, and that's in collaboration with other commands as well. So for the last couple of years, we've been doing Operation Noble Defender, which has been typically is establishing an air defense presence in and through the Arctic as well as the rest of North America. But more to your question about Arctic Edge, so Arctic Edge occurs every 2 years, so that'll be taking place in Alaska, as well as ICEX, which is taking place just north of Alaska. Canada has Operation Nanook, which is happening through the Arctic archipelago, and NATO has Cold Response, which is happening in the North Atlantic.
And what do these exercises generally contain? What's their purpose and what are they generally doing?
So Arctic Edge has very much land focus. Some Marines, Army folks, as well as some NORAD assets or Canadian assets, I should say, taking place, focusing basically conducting land operations in through the Arctic. ISEX is essentially, nuclear capable submarines conducting basically familiarization, patrols, if you will, in there. And there's a significant distinguished visitor program with that as well, kind of highlighting the capabilities there in the Arctic. Operation Anook is a kind of a mix of land and maritime assets, basically emphasizing Canadian domestic sovereignty over the area. And NATO Cold Response is a bit of a moving target, but essentially it's a significant maritime presence in the North Atlantic for 2022.
I think you had sent an image here that comes from Nanook.
Yeah, so that is the Arctic offshore patrol vessel Harry DeWolf, which recently just completed its circumnavigation of the North American continent. So starting out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, it went through the Northwest Passage down through to the Panama Canal, and then went back to home port.
Wow. And so these are all good opportunities then for practicing essentially coordination, all the different things that everyone that all the different forces do to I guess there's probably a piece of everything in that. There's probably a piece of preparation, a piece of understanding, and a piece of sending a little bit of a message.
Well, again, the words of General Van Herk, in order to compete in the Arctic, you need to be on the field. So essentially, if anyone in your audience has ever been to the Arctic, it's not a matter of simply getting in a car and getting there. It's a lot to it, not only just from an environmental standpoint, but also in being able to maintain your equipment while there. They have a saying: if you're in the Arctic, you operate at Arctic speed, and that is to say that you operate at a speed that the environment will allow you, but at the same time, more from an Army standpoint or a land force standpoint, is that you're so bundled up and you're just trying to stay warm, but you need to stay cold enough not to sweat, because if you sweat, then you get wet, the sweat freezes, and then you're in a lot of trouble, especially when things like -60 and below.
Mm, absolutely. And especially I'll show the distant early warning line because it sends the message of cold and what it means up there. How much
I love
of
that photo.
I know, isn't that cool? It looks like it's from Star Wars or something.
Yeah, yeah. Basically, it's from Hoth or whatever planet is. Yeah, that's.
Yes,
And if you
except
look
this is
really,
real.
yeah, if you look really closely at the bottom of the picture there, you can see footprints.
Oh my God, I do. That's amazing. Not
Yes.
footprints that I want to actually be part of in anything like that.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so, I mean, the Arctic, I think, is an important thing. As you mentioned, it's an area that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention in the daily news feed, but it's kind of the most hotly contested, most busiest. Everyone, when we talk about how close we are against um, foreign, not so friendly governments in some cases, things like that, we're right up against everything in the Arctic, and that seems to be becoming more and more of a contested place. Is that what NORAD is kind of seeing in the operations it has to do?
Well, with climate change and depleting ice levels there, and it's something that's very real for the folks in Alaska who operate there day to day, is essentially it's opening things up, and basically the whole conversation about the Northwest Passage is a modern day thing, whereas even 50 years ago it'd be inconceivable to think that you could go through the Arctic. And so when you think about things like opening sea lanes and increased trade opportunities, if you will, and natural resources, with all that becomes increased activity, and then with increased activity becomes nations trying to explore economic opportunities, and all the things that stems from that. I mean, from a military standpoint, there's obviously security interest there, but also from a standpoint of simply just making sure that things remain safe.
Hmm.
Thankfully, there are a lot of diplomatic venues to kind of push that conversation along.
Hmm.
But yeah, essentially, yeah, we have seen a lot of research vessels, let's say, going in and exploring what sort of things could be exploited. Uh, and we're attentive to these things, and we're cognizant of that, but at the same time, fully support of the freedom of the seas, and just want to make sure that things stay peaceful now and in the future.
I like how there's just a bit of a of a glimmer when you say vessels.
Well, they're like freedom of the seas. They can go and look all they want.
Yeah, it depends how long they stay, I suppose. And also, are you then monitoring what they're, anything that they use as far as gathering information on your own forces in there?
I'll plead the fifth.
Okay, only so much you can answer on something like that then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. Now, from our image that we put up before, that was the original distant early warning line or current. Um, where does most of the information come now? Is it still from largely land-based, or is it almost all based on satellite and space sensing? Where does most of your information come from?
Good question, actually, because it's coming from a lot of different areas. So anything from below the surface of the sea to space and even cyberspace. Uh, so what we're trying to do now, because the evolution of threats is no longer just simply like a bear bomber coming over the top and then dropping gravity bombs. We've seen a plethora of things applied to kind of impede, you know, international and domestic security for that standpoint in both kinetic and non-kinetic ways. That
Mhm.
is basically through, use of force and use of things that aren't necessarily use of force, like say cyber attacks, for example, right? So in trying to determine where the threats are coming from and the appropriate means of dealing with them uh, becomes very much a multi-domain problem. There's a bunch of other unspoken problems I'm not talking to right now, and that's basically like say the idea of like what is an aggressive cyber attack, for example, and then from there, what's the appropriate response to that, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of figuring out to do, and you kind of figure out where the needle moves and kind of triggers a response. But all that to say, still all very much security threats, and in one threat in one domain uh, may or will likely actually impact other domains. And even beyond that, from a security perspective, things that threaten security, not necessarily in a military aspect, could impact other things from a diplomatic information or even an economic impact for national interest, if you will.
Interesting. Yeah, because I don't think that your mind necessarily goes to cybersecurity when you think about North American Aerospace Defense Command, but you're saying essentially it's all interweaved because you're one of the responses to something like that.
Well, I guess something like a very common-ish example, and just kind of bleed into kind of illustrate that point a little bit. But if you have a cyber attack that degrades your refueling capability in a remote location, and you don't have any redundancies to back that up, then essentially that impacts your air operations in that area as well,
Mm.
right? So a bit of a convoluted example, but just kind of shows how something in a non-kinetic realm can have very real impacts in the kinetic space.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And you were talking before about global information dominance. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it comes back to the need to be aware of all of these threats, right? Whether they are like below the surface, on the surface, in the maritime domain, air domain, cyber, or even in space. Space plays a large part in our ability to monitor things globally. So an attack in the space domain obviously basically blinds us from an air defense operation standpoint. So so being aware of all those threats in multi-domains is kind of how we're looking at, bringing that piece together a little bit. But in addition to that, it's a matter of pulling that information in that can speak a common language, if you will, that everyone can kind of discern and act on. The challenge in the past has been typically like we have like a ground radar that's designed to look for a certain target at a certain altitude, certain composition operating at a certain speed.
Hmm.
And it's very geared towards that particular threat. However, we've done a bunch of research with regards to what sort of other information is available for those same sensors, and found that there is a vast majority of information that's also applicable that we could use that is basically left on the cutting room floor of the sensor analysis.
Hmm.
So we're looking to pull that in just from like a terrestrial radar standpoint, and then combine that with space information, as well as things from maritime domain, and kind of pull all of that into essentially like an information cloud that
Hmm.
can be analyzed using artificial intelligence or machine learning, and to kind of look at all that information at computer speeds essentially, and then spit out information that can be acted upon by commanders to kind of like look at the threat assessment and then determine what an appropriate response is going to be. So what I'll walk through there a little bit was essentially the need for all domain awareness, and then basically pulling these data and information from sensors, and then applying machine learning and artificial intelligence to kind of produce valuable information for threat assessments, if you will.
Right.
And that's the information dominance piece. So basically, it's not a matter of just having all the awareness, but a matter of having good information timely that you can act on as soon as possible.
Right. So it all makes sense when you kind of know what to expect or what fits a certain pattern if you're getting an intrusion or probing. What is it called when we do see things coming in or near the ADIS?
Uh, I just call it an ADIS incursion.
Incursion. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So on that, actually, yeah, as opposed to getting too deep, I'll just back up a step. Uh, so essentially, once you have that information, then essentially it comes down to being able to act on things earlier.
Hmm.
Uh, but the way threats are nowadays, with say like hypersonics, for example, with munitions that are able to travel in excess of Mach 5, highly maneuverable, with defeat mechanisms as well that effectively can hold any target in Canada, the United States, at risk. Uh, so
Let's explain that to people for a minute, because hypersonics are in the news quite a bit here, and matter of fact, there's a couple images we have here uh, that kind of explain they are why the term hypersonic is so alarming in terms of military development.
yeah, so I guess going back to the old threat, if you will, is basically being ballistic missiles. If you see there the very traditional arc from point to point, um, essentially folks with a lot bigger brains than me can take a look at that and throw a mathematical calculation at it, and then with some degree of certainty throw up a ballistic missile interceptor to remove that threat. The challenge that hypersonics pose is that they're able to have the same effective range as ballistic missiles, if not more, and operate at speeds that exceed, or at least make being aware of their launch and their trajectory extremely challenging.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like the punch you don't see coming, right?
Right.
Uh, so in that respects, in addition to that, they're extremely maneuverable. So when a ballistic missile launched, it was very predictable in its trajectory of where it was going to go. However, hypersonics can launch and be in a certain vector towards a nation, for example, and then take a hard left and go to a completely different country, right?
Wow.
So,
Yep.
and that changes your calculus again on where that's going to go. So, with that high degree of maneuverability and its speeds, essentially, you're compressing your decision space, right? Because you need to be able to be aware of this, and you need to be able to, develop a credible response to deal with it. But if you're talking about, you know, um, having to deal with a threat in a couple of minutes versus a few hours, that makes a world of difference, especially as a commander, when you need to talk to national leadership about your assessment of the threat and what you
Hmm.
think the appropriate response is going to be. So the idea is to get further left of launch from any particular threat. And what I mean by that is being aware of certain cues of things that are happening elsewhere in the world that can constitute basically an assessment that a potential threat is underway. Like say, for
Right.
example, say if we have artificial intelligence basically looking at the plethora of sensors and can depict that there is increased parking traffic at a particular base, which is usual activity if the base is going to do a launch, for example,
Hmm.
right? So certain other triggers are kind of go
Like a
into
staging
usual.
and preparation, basically trying to find signs that something's going to happen. I mean, that's really interesting because I mean, we're basically saying that the weapon itself is so fast, and of course, there's many nations now who either have or close to completing hypersonic weapons that uh, we have to spend more and more time about trying to predict before something's going to launch. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and so essentially, even beyond that is recognizing that the appropriate response is not necessarily a military response. Say for coming back to the original example, if there's increased parking traffic at a particular base, which is constituted a usual launch activity, then that is something we can offer to our national leadership to say, hey, maybe there is a diplomatic engagement here or something that they determine is most appropriate to kind of mitigate that threat. Because the long and short of it is, once the launch happens, then we have, a much shorter decision time to act on things versus, engaging earlier in that process.
Do you think that the concepts of hypersonic weapons, hypersonic missiles, is going to uh, kind of change the day-to-day of what it really means that these things like at like foreign countries, ADIZ incursions and the things that you're normally looking at, if you if countries then have the ability of doing something so much faster and so much more dramatic, then does it really matter as much to be skirting along the lines of there with a bomber? What do you see what you typically are going to focus on 10 years from now being quite a bit different?
Well, things are quite a bit different now, actually. Mainly because, much to your point, you kind of alluded to it essentially how things have kind of have like a regional approach to them. So like NORAD has its mission set and things it's concerned about. European Command might have things that it's concerned about. But the important thing is to kind of meld these organizations together and from an allied and partnership perspective, look at these things from a global perspective, and that's kind of like one of the things we're getting after from the global integration standpoint, so that when we're talking about aircraft outside of NORAD's area of operations, for example, it's not uniquely just a NORAD problem set, but it's also something, say, Indo-PACOM or EUCOM can lean in and support as well. So again, so I guess we kind of walk the entire gamut there a little bit between the all domain awareness, being aware what's out there, having the technology available to run through the threat assessments at an exponential pace, and then working with our other combatant commands to deal with those threats, and of course our national leadership as well.
Got it. So, what do you think's coming next before we switch over to some of the some of the fun talk of what's actually happening back there right now, Santa Tracker, et cetera? What do you see next on the horizon for NORAD, and how your role is going to be changing there?
Well, there's a lot of conversations with regards to what NORAD is becoming. I mean, the subject of NORAD modernization has been broached by both national leaderships from Canada and the United States. But the best we can do right now is just kind of identify what the current and evolving threats are going to be, and then just kind of facilitate the discussion on how each country wants NORAD to deal with that. We're very much looking forward for that next stage of the process, but right now, all we can just talk about is what we see.
Yeah. And speaking of what you see or what you don't see, one thing I have to also ask you, we've gotten some questions in. There's been over the past year with Air Force releasing certain news and footage, et cetera, of the concepts of, UFOs and objects that have shown up on things. Does NORAD play a role in this, in trying to identify things and in some of even the incidents that have been reported within or near the borders?
Certainly from an aerospace warning perspective, we like to keep an eye on things on both Canadian and American airspace, and to determine what potential threats there are. Thankfully, I've had the opportunity to do dozens of interviews on this very subject, so able to kind of walk through a variety of scenarios. These guys even dug up previously classified material and kind of share, okay, this is what I have, can you share information on it? And one was particularly interesting, actually, but it kind of speaks to how we do business on a day-to-day basis. So there was a report of a medevac flight coming out of Alaska and going down to Washington. So flying out of Alaska, going down through British Columbia, its final destination was going to be in Washington State. Canadian NORAD region had identified a potential track following behind the medevac. So reaching back and talk to Alaskan NORAD region, hey, do you see this? Well, no, we don't. And so some talk back and forth, but as some of you may know, radars are interesting things, very useful. Sometimes anomalous readings can occur that picked up on one sensor, not picked up on another, but the whole point of having an integrated layered defense system is that you can actually fly fighters out to get a visual identification on what's there. So in this particular case, sensors in Canada picked it up, sensors in Alaska did not, so they scrambled fighters out of Canada to go and escort the medevac flight and to kind of see if there's anything following it. They get on site and there's nothing there, but just to be safe, they do a patrol until they hit bingo and then return to base. Medevac continues on to Washington. In the end, nothing to be seen. So I guess just to walk through that scenario there, essentially it's just anomalous radar readings that in the end ended up being nothing, but for the sake of security, conducted the visual identification, return to base. And that happens quite often, actually, as far as like anomalous radar readings. Had another one where basically in the Arctic archipelago, there was something being picked up on radar intermittently. So basically the thing would pick up, go away, pick up, go away, right? Over a span of like a couple of hours. Essentially, from our standpoint, the way we look at it is it a security threat? Well, it's in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic archipelago, no threat to anyone in the vicinity. So unless it vectors in towards some critical infrastructure or demonstrates some hostile intent, doesn't constitute a security response. Now, to this day, I don't know what that may have been. It may have been just some bush pilot doing touch and goes. I really don't know. But from our standpoint, we look at it as a security threat. Yes, no, no. continue to monitor if it continues to be a persistent presence that may constitute a threat. But in that case, no threat. But in the other case, we thought it might be. Scrambled fighters took a look, nothing there, returned to base.
Would the same thing happen inside the borders as well? When you hear of some of these cases, again, the Air Force has come out with certain things where they said, yes, these are reports we don't have answers to. Here, we even have some footage, things like that. Are those, when situations like that were to, or if they were to arise, or when they have arisen in the past, is NORAD involved in trying to ascertain what it is, or in some cases, perhaps scrambling response, as you mentioned?
Well, I think the as in-depth as NORAD gets is basically the example, the two examples I read through. But if you have not read the report to Congress on UAPs, unexplained aerial phenomena, I think it is, that's an extremely interesting read, and it comes from an intelligence standpoint, and they have a very, very interesting take. I did not think that report would have come out the way it did, but it was certainly an interesting read. And to give you the bottom line up front, from my perspective, it basically said something to the effect of, we are developing top secret things. If you see them, let us know. Our adversaries are developing top secret things. If you see them, let us know.
I like that a lot. That's an excellent summary. In fact, that's the wonderful Cliff Notes version of that report. And for anyone that does want to actually read that, what was that report that was done?
Congressional report to Congress on unexplained aerial phenomenon.
Excellent. I'm going to reach out and take a look at that, but I love the summary.
That's my
very
takeaway
appropriate.
anyway. Yeah.
Exactly. They may be unidentified, but we may know about them, and if you are detecting them, we want to know. Excellent. So I want to make sure at the end, one of the things that is so much fun and such a wonderful thing that NORAD does, of course, is every year touches the lives of so many children around the world with its Santa tracker. And I think it's fascinating that it is actually around the world. And I first want to show people if you about what the actual website, if you actually go there to NORAD Track Santa, there's a ton here. If you have a small child somewhere in your family, you've got to go check out this page. It's education and games and so many things that go on. It's very, very cool. But of course, the coolest things are what actually happen on the 25th, on the 24th, the evening, and into the 25th. And the team and everything that they do around all this. So tell me a little bit about what goes on with Santa at NORAD.
Well, before I get too far away, because I may forget about it, but the games on that website are maliciously difficult. Something that is far beyond my skill set. But if you throw an 8-year-old out there, I'm sure they'll master it in no time flat. But yeah, so the whole NORAD Track Santa thing, essentially began in 1955 with our predecessor, Continental Air Defense Command, and we picked it up in 1958 when NORAD was stand up. It's been a 66-year tradition ever since. But essentially, we talk about that mission in the same capacity we talk about our day-to-day mission that we conduct, 365 days a year, and that's basically monitoring potential threats globally. Not say Santa's a threat, but the same method we use to kind of detect ballistic missile launches is also used to detect Santa's nose as he transits around the world, and of course, until it finally approaches North America, and then we can transit to our terrestrial radars and our fighters to kind of escort him through Canadian and American airspace as he transits west and back into the Pacific and finally to the North Pole.
That's so cool, and it's staffed entirely by, I guess, volunteers that are part of that. Tell us a little bit about what the actual operation is.
So the actual operation itself is essentially military members and their families, and in the years past, prior to COVID, we've had folks from the public, from the local community, even across the country actually, show up to the operations center in Peterson Space Force Base. And so we have about 1,500 people in the past show up there to answer about 150,000 phone calls from around the world. Uh,
Because kids call, right? I mean,
oh,
that's
kids of all ages call. Uh, so anyone in your audience out there, if you're north of 60, by all means, 1-877 hi NORAD. If you feel in the mood to talk to somebody on Christmas Eve about where Santa is, we'll be there.
say that number again, please, for everybody.
Yeah, 1-877 hi, as in hi, NORAD.
And you will get someone on the line there, a live person. You'll be able to ask them what's going on, where Santa is at that moment, and how the tracking's going.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if talking to a real live person is not your thing, and you'd like the visual depiction, you can go to noradsanta.org, the website you brought up there earlier, and there will be a visual depiction as well as a tracking of where Santa is, how many gifts he's delivered. Beyond that, we also have, if you have Amazon Alexa in your house, you can ask Alexa, hey, where's Santa? You'll get the latest from there as well.
And that's powered by NORAD. NORAD.
Oh, okay, all right. Not powered by NORAD. We have a list of contributors and partners who make this program possible each and every year. Even the call center is helped by partners such as Verizon to give us the capability. Because as you can imagine, the military is really not in the business of conducting call centers day to day.
To
So
150,000 calls in 24 hours.
yeah, exactly, right. So we rely on folks on the commercial side of things to kind of lean in and basically volunteer personnel, expertise, and equipment to make this thing possible each and every year. Microsoft, for example, does the website.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, Major Hillier, I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your holidays and your busy schedule to join us here on Social Flight Live. I really value it. It's a wonderful tradition to be able to check in with NORAD. So many pilots, so many Social Flight users and members of our community are ex-military, are veterans, and people who have such a close affinity and respect for the work that you do, and that everyone else does to keep both of our nations safe.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the support. And
Absolutely.
by all means, and more than happy to continue this tradition. And we'll see you on the 24th.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Again, as always, that's Major Cameron Hillier, and congratulations again to him on becoming Major between last year's show and this year's show. So thrilled to it. And again, thank you to all of you for the past year, for being here and being part of the Social Flight and the General Aviation community. We care very deeply about all of you. We are here in this entire show and everything we do to support General Aviation, and we want to continue that as we move into 2022. I will show one more time here because I got some requests for it here on the line to show everyone what our little special thing is that we have. And again, that's going to be our Social Flight Globe 3D. And behind me here is that Mustang that's being built. Haven't checked anything here. We'll be going after the show to info@socialflight.com and just grabbing the first 20, and we'll put everybody else on a waiting list if we're able to do something to create more in the future. But I'll tell you, I haven't been able to stop touching this thing since it arrived on my desk, and it's just a thank you for everything that you've done and a chance to help us along the way. Until next time, I'd just like to wish all of you a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and to all of you, blue skies. Good night, everyone.